Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Modern Health with Dr. Jane. Today I have Mitch Marchand who is joining me, and he is an electrical engineer that turned into an EMF consultant. And I actually learned from you, Mitch, from Jordan, who did radon in my house, who remediated radon. So I was really happy to hear the connection. But thanks so much for being here. I have lots of questions around EMF, so we are excited to have you here.
Amazing. I'm always excited to geek out on this EMF stuff.
And I obviously, when I hired you to come to the house and do an EMF inspection, I always like to get to know the people that are coming into my house. And one of the first things they'll ask is like, hey, how did you get into this? And I was super excited to hear that you are also married to a naturopath. But why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what it is that you were doing before and then how you got into being an EMF consultant?
I kind of fell into this when my wife became sick when she moved into our 600 square foot condo in downtown Calgary. My wife was running all these hormone panels, all these different tests to try to figure out why she just wasn't feeling very well. She thought it was a new clinic that she moved to. Eventually she was like, oh yeah, I remember some environmental medicine stuff saying, there's these things called EMFs. Maybe this could be affecting my health. So she bought this EMF meter, took it to the clinic, and nothing showed up. And when she brought it home, it was just off the charts. She sat me down that evening and said, you know what, I think we should move. So we made the quick change. 2 weeks later, we moved to a new place and all her symptoms went away.
And what kind of symptoms did she have? Like, how bad was it? Because from my understanding, it was pretty bad.
The most significant symptoms were she felt like she was getting actually jolted awake at night. And the consequence of everything else that was happening is she was just becoming kind of chronically sick. And that's just not her standard mode of operation. So yeah, as an electrical engineer, I programmed the computers that controlled power plants for 9 years. And I was still doing it at the time. And I was just kind of intrigued by how all this stuff works. And yeah, so I took a dive into this building biology course to kind of explain this to me. As an electrical engineer, these things were starting to click, and we're conductive just like transformers and other things. There's these interactions that happen with anything conductive, including ourselves. So yeah, we ended up starting a naturopathic clinic, and I started doing EMF assessments shortly after this all happened. So yeah, it's all because of my wife, who's a naturopathic doctor that that got me.
Well, and because we're aware, right? Like we're in tune. It's the same when I moved into this house and we had radon. I right away, I was like, something is in this house, and we like mold. And it took a while to figure out that it was radon because, again, it was not on my radar. And I do think that there's still the electrical component that we'll talk about that we have to fix. But curious, how long did it take for your wife to figure out that it was EMFs? Like, was it months? Was it weeks?
It was like 6 months. Yeah,
6 months, because it's hard, right? Like it's hard to you're running the hormone tests, you're running all that jazz. And now, did you feel any symptoms? Because I think we talked about when we met, because your wife was experiencing this, but you just weren't to the same extent, or you just weren't aware?
Yeah, it wasn't to the same extent. Like if I were to work from home and I would just kind of have this low grade blah by like 3-4 o'clock, right? Versus if I go to work and come back, it seemed like I had a little bit more energy. But it would be very hard for me to tie those two together unless this happened. And it wasn't until we moved when we noticed like the step change, right? Like often people do is, if they go on vacation or if they kind of unplug and do those type of things, they kind of notice that step change. And then when they come back into that environment, they kind of fall back into into that slump. So yeah,
I think that's a really big way to tell actually if your environment is something is off. And that's what triggered for me. I was like, okay, I'm not crazy, because we went away for like 5 days. And it wasn't great sleeping conditions. Like we were sleeping in the same room as our kids, but like my heart rate dropped. I felt more rested. And then as soon as we got back home, it was like, how come I don't feel better sleeping in my own bed? Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes you don't realize it until you're out of the environment and you come back in and you're like, yeah, something's off here. Let's take us back to the beginning. What are EMFs? What are EMFs and why should we care?
Exactly. So we'll just start with some natural forms of electromagnetic fields, right? These EMFs are kind of like sound, and there's different pitches or different frequencies. And the higher the frequency, the higher the energy. So on the very low end, we have static magnetic fields like you'd find in the earth. This is how compasses work. This is how magnets work. Then if we kind of go up in frequency a little bit or in pitch, we have these things at 60 hertz, which is the electricity in our environment. So sources of electromagnetic fields in your home is just the wiring in your home. It can be different pumps and motors. It could be wiring errors in your home. And these will create an elevated human-created electromagnetic field environment in your home. And then if we go up a little bit higher than that, we get into these kilohertz ranges, which is kind of thousands of vibrations per second of electricity, and that kind of gets us into electrical noise. So this can happen from dimmer switches, certain lighting fixtures, computers, anything that converts AC electricity, which is what comes in from the grid, to DC electricity, which all electronics use, can create this electrical noise. And if we keep going up in frequency or pitch, we get into the wireless tech environment, which is what probably most people assume is electromagnetic fields. And this includes, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phones, and all those things. And then if we go up even higher, we get into another natural form of EMF called light. And light is an actual natural or human-created electromagnetic field. And then if we keep going up higher than that, we get into this ionizing radiation, which is like X-rays, gamma rays, and nuclear radiation. And those we all know are detrimental with very short-term exposures. But it's all these non-ionizing that we talked about, the electricity, the wireless tech, all that stuff is kind of where a little bit of the debate is on what's considered safe or what's considered healthy.
Yeah. So you said 60 hertz for just like the electricity in the house. What were some of the other ones, like where it's the wireless and the dim and the switches, just to give us an idea in the number range?
Yeah. So dirty electricity is between usually anything above 1.7 kilohertz can go up to, let's say, hundreds of kilohertz.
Okay.
And so that's the electrical noise. The reason why it's 1.7 is as the frequency goes up in that area, the human resistance goes down. So above this 1.7 kilohertz is when things start to go internally to us. So that's kind of the interesting thing about dirty electricity. When we go up into the wireless technology, you think of FM radio, which is in the 100 megahertz. You think of Wi-Fi, which is at 2.4 gigahertz, which is billions of hertz, up to 5 gigahertz. Then we have cell phone frequencies between 600 megahertz all the way up to 6 gigahertz. And then in Canada, we don't have the millimeter wave, but those are in the tens of gigahertz, and those are in the US, Australia, and some of the other countries, and will be deployed here probably sometime in 2024.
Those are big numbers. Yeah. Is there a number for the ionizing radiation? Like you talked about the X-rays and the...
Yeah, that gets up. That's really high. And I forget what the actual frequency is off the top of my head, but it's way above light, and we're getting into really high frequencies.
I got into just trying to understand like the ionizing and ionizing, and essentially like the ionizing, my understanding is that like it will actually change the structure. Like it takes the atom away and is able to destructure DNA, whereas the non-ionizing doesn't. And so that's where you were saying there's some controversy in terms of like, hey, because it doesn't cause the structural damage, it's fine. But obviously there's this thermal effect. There is like, it's still the electrical noise. I like when you use that term because it's like our nervous system is picking up on that, even though we feel like it's fine.
It's all interesting when we look at like everyone agrees that when we're exposed to these electromagnetic fields, it heats us up, causes our muscles or nerves to fire. That's a bad thing, right? And everyone can agree on that.
Because you're at rest. You're thinking you're at rest, but you're not.
Yeah, and it's very easy to prove those things. So those were the effects that they found way back when, right? Basically, the chocolate bar melting in the radar operator's pants, right, was due to thermal heating, right? And so we know that is not ideal, right? So the question is, are there biological effects below this, right, that are causing these problems? So what
are some of the problems you're seeing that it's like, obviously we can talk about fertility, but when you came to the house, like what I loved is how knowledgeable you were and some of the things that you're seeing impacted. So tell us what are some of the things that you're seeing for health effects yourself and also in just research.
When it comes down to anything related to electromagnetic fields, the biggest one is increased oxidative stress, which is inflammation. Now, our body gets increased oxidative stress when we go out in the sun too long, right? But that is a very brief exposure, right? So the concern is what happens if we have increased oxidative stress from electromagnetic fields 24/7, right? And the cumulative effect of that over long periods of time. So that, oxidative stress is a signaling system inside of our body, and we just need to, but if it's always signaling, right, that's just an overload, and it's this constant stress that we're worried about. So other things that we're seeing is mitochondrial dysfunction, increased oxidative stress, which I mentioned, open up the blood-brain barrier, but it also comes down to neurological and hormone changes, affecting people's sleep-wake cycles. There's the fertility side of things, like sperm virility is one that has tons of research on. And then we have the cancers. And, if we're exposed to this, it's not like we're worried about the day, month, or year type of exposure, but it's a cumulative effect over like 5, 10, 15 years is when they start to see certain increases of cancer, right?
Yep.
So if you live next to an FM radio transmitter, after about 10 years, we see higher rates of breast cancer. And we've actually seen that in certain locations where people are living for over 10 years. I've actually been to people's homes where this 10-year latency is proving out for their case. So yeah, so there's all sorts when we talk specifically about kind of fertility and childhood development. In 2008 and 2012, they looked at 10,000 children, and researchers concluded that tens of thousands of children, I think it was about 40,000 in total. The researchers concluded that children exposed to cell phones before and after birth were more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems than children who were not exposed to the phones. And it affects kids in a very unique way as well, because kids have the safety guidelines, let's just say for wireless tech, was based on a 220-pound mannequin. Okay.
Yep.
And
totally.
children,
Yeah. Versus like a 10-pound or a 15-pound, 20-pound, whatever. Yeah.
Right. So what happens is kids actually absorb 10 times more radio frequency radiation than adults do in their bone marrow because their bone marrow is smaller, right? So this is specifically around the skull of a child. So the radiation actually penetrates even deeper into them than it would an adult, just due to the softer bone around the skull. So yeah, there's literally, when I do public talks, I do a one-pager that shows a summary of 4,900 peer-reviewed studies and the health effects that each of them get broken down to. And it's just incredible with just the different facets of this. It's affecting people's sleep, it's affecting people's neurological system. It actually affects DNA. There's actually DNA damage, enzymes, right?
Bacteria, you said the way the
yeah.
bacteria.
Yep, the gut
We're
biome.
basically bags of meat with like bacteria walking around, right? Like humans are more cells bacteria than we are human cells even. So unless it's the first time in the morning and you just pooped and you cleared some bacteria, but for the most part, you're walking bag of bacteria. So as soon as I hear something is impacting bacteria, I'm like, well, then it has to impact us in a very big way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to be that the EMFs are kind of like a catalyst for deregulation or dysfunction as well, because there's lots of synergistic effects as well, right? We find that, if there is lead exposure and EMFs, the effects are amplified, right? Or so there's all these people who have poor detox mechanisms, right, have higher levels of mercury, let's say, in their body, and they have a different set of symptoms that are amplified as a result of that. So it's kind of like a catalyst. It's not a silver bullet. By removing your EMF, it doesn't reduce everything. But even people with like neurological conditions like MS and Parkinson's, their symptoms seem to come down a few notches when they reduce EMFs in their environment, which is incredible.
I've recorded a couple things around EMS, and obviously this is a topic that I teach a lot in my Maximize Fertility program, because it's sometimes we're looking for the silver bullet. And the truth is, like, in our day and age now, I think that there isn't a silver bullet, but it's a combination of a lot of these tiny little pellets, if you will, that add up to a silver bullet. Because you're looking at, okay, pesticides and herbicides in your diet, and then whatever crap that's coming in through the water, including pharmaceuticals and bacteria and blah. And then you have the EMF exposure, and then you're not moving your body. And then whatever is being sprayed in the air or fires. And then it's just like, well, what is the body supposed to function on? You know what I mean? So then it adds up to this. So it's definitely something that I've started not to overlook, because before, like 5 years ago, if you told me about it, I was like, it's not that big of a deal. And now it's like, no, I think it like really matters.
Yeah, and it's just getting a little bit more complicated as well. Like if you just sit back and think about, in your own home, can you count how many wireless devices somebody has in their home, right? Let's say it's 15. That's a very common number. If you were to go back even like 5 years from now, earlier, that number would probably be like 10 or 5. And if you go
Yep.
back 20 years from now, it would be even lower. So
Yep.
it just seems to be that these technologies are kind of creeping up into our lives a lot faster, and there's a whole lot more convenience that's coming with them. But there's a consequence for that, right? And there's oftentimes ways to use this technology in just a slightly different way that can just be more biocompatible with people. And
Totally.
it's not just people, it's humans, it's plants, it's your pets.
Animals.
Yeah, it's the whole, it's everything living,
Yep.
right? So
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny you say that, okay, like the little things creeping in. So when you came in, some of the EMF things that were a big surprise for me, if you will, like our oven. So we didn't have a lot of smart devices, but now I see that that's part of, like, my sister just got a new washer and dryer, and it has that little smart device thing component to it, right? Because then you can turn on your washing machine when you're going out for a walk or something, I guess. Like, that's a thing that we need to have now, right? But that was emitting an insane amount, and it was impacting, like, it was going up into one of the girls' bedrooms. Again, it's not one of those like light bulb moments where all of a sudden she slept through the night and it was perfect, but we definitely felt something in the house that was like, oh, it's like we slept a little bit better. I don't know what it is, but we did,
yeah, and that's the issue with these wireless technologies is they transmit 24/7 a pulse radiation. And pulse radiation or pulse signals doesn't occur naturally in nature unless there's like a thunderstorm, right? And
Mm.
that's like a
Which
one-time
doesn't happen
event.
all the time.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, like your oven was directly below one of the bedrooms, right? And it was transmitting a signal 24/7, even though you'd even know it was a smart stove and had no intentions of using it. Nobody uses the smart things on their appliances
Devices
in
for the most
general.
part, yeah.
Yeah, but they're just turned on, and we were able to kind of disconnect it and do that. It was looked like I was doing brain surgery on your stove, but I was just simply unplugging something inside the stove to
Yep.
just turn off that module. Everything else works fine in the stove, just no longer transmits a wireless signal. So yeah, smart appliances. During COVID, is very hard to get appliances, so some people just had to get them. So we had to find a way to work with it, and that was a solution that we did at your house, was just unplugging the wireless module inside of it, and that still allows you to purchase a smart appliance, just not use the smart ability for your notifications
Totally.
if you leave the fridge open
Yep.
in the middle of the night. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. Well, let's talk, because there was another thing that came up in another one of my girls' bedroom where you talked about the recommended kind of EMF exposure worldwide and what the WHO recommends, and like when we start to see disease. And so it was right where her crib was. This is when we dug deeper, we realized that there's just some electrical issues in the house. But talk about some of the recommended numbers first of all, and then we'll talk about solutions after.
What's considered safe in the world is not universally agreed upon, right? So
Great.
So we're going to talk just wireless technology, and then we're just going to talk about these magnetic fields, which is due to electricity flowing in and around your space. So the wireless technology in Canada and the US is in a unit of microwatts per meter squared. And it's in the US, it's 10 million. In Canada, it's 4.3 million and microwatts per meter squared. And that level is what protects you from overheating from one frequency over a period of 6 minutes. Okay. If you look at your cell phone, just as one example, it has two bands of Wi-Fi, a band of Bluetooth. It has this thing called NFC, which is what you use for tap payments. And then it has several cell phone frequencies, and you're exposed to that well over 6 minutes, right? But the exposure of that is at a lower amount, that it doesn't actually heat your body. But if we look at other safety guidelines, what happens? Where do biological effects start happening, right? So 10 million and 4.3 million is US and Canada, for example. If we look at what 40% of the population of the earth, so this includes China and India and some of the Eastern European countries, they have safety guidelines at 100,000, right? And
Wow.
that's based on oxidative stress, or it's based on 3 hours or longer durations. And it's based on increased oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, and opening up the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is this protective layer around your brain that's supposed to keep chemicals and things out. And it opens up more when we're exposed to these radio frequencies. They use this for cancer treatments and things like that to actually increase the permeability of that to allow drugs to pass through. So it's used medically, but we also see it at just from cell phones and things like that. The 10 million, the 4.3 million, the 100,000. And then if we go down to, and then the World Health Organization considers wireless technology from cell phones and Wi-Fi as a possible human carcinogen. They don't set an actual level for that, but that is a class 2B possible carcinogen by the World Health Organization. Then if we go and ask the people on the front lines, the actual environmental medicine doctors that are actually trying to help people get better based on environmental causes, they want to see, I'm generalizing here, but there's a document called the European 2016 EMF guidelines, and they want to see daytime exposures of about 100 or less, not 100,000, just 100, and nighttime exposures of 10. Right.
Yeah, so which then, the 10 is mimicking a lot more of like the nature and like our natural rhythm, right?
Exactly. And so the big question is, Mitch, those are nice, fine and dandy numbers, but is that actually realistic in the realistic world? When we turn off the wireless environment in your home at night, we typically land at 10 or less in the basement, if you're in a basement, and 100 or less on the main floor. And if we go up one level to the second level, usually it'll be a little bit higher just because you're more direct line of sight to cell towers and outside exposures. So it is realistic. And most times we can reduce whatever exposures in the house by about 80% or more. Just by strategically looking at your wireless system in your home. It is achievable in most cases. And at night, we don't need the Wi-Fi on. We don't need a lot of the wireless devices on. So we can usually get down to some really, really low levels with that. So that is the wireless kind of environment. When we look at the magnetic fields, and this is kind of what we found in the one room there in the nursery, right? We found some wiring errors, and the way that those exposures work is at 833 milligauss in Canada, 1,000 in the US, is the level in which we get exposed to these fields. And what they do is they induce a current inside of our body, a human-created current. Our blood is conductive, and it induces a current in anything that's a closed loop that's conductive. So it induces a current in our body. And if that current gets strong enough so that muscles and nerves start firing, that's what the 1,833, these things called milligauss, are protecting us from. When we look at the World Health Organization, they saw the doubling of childhood leukemia cases for people who live next to power lines in the range of 3 to 4 milligauss.
Yep.
Right. And then the environmental medicine doctors want to see a 1 hour or 4 hour average of 1 milligauss or less. Okay. So in that sleeping area that we found from a wiring error, we were getting as high as like 9, 8.
Yeah, especially when everything was on in the house versus like when we turned it off, it was around more 1 to 3, I believe. And then as soon as we turned it on, it was at like 9, 10. That's where they're supposed to be resting. And so like if the babies are restless, all that jazz, and we're like, it's colic, they're growing, it's teething. And it's like, or maybe we're just frying them.
Yeah. And again, it's not that silver bullet. I know, sleep for getting your kids to sleep is like, please make them sleep, whatever you can. But we have seen some significant changes in kids when we turn off like baby monitors, fix the wiring errors in the home, and those type of things. It just creates a more calmer environment electromagnetically in the environment. So that can be good. But yeah, that was kind of a big find at your house was kind of these wiring errors that are causing this field. And those wiring errors are things that if your home is wired to the precise electrical code, it's not an issue. It's just sometimes there's these errors that occur based on the way that it's wired that isn't to code. And it isn't to code because it is a safety issue from a shock hazard or increases fire risks. It also has this side effect of creating this electromagnetic field. So
yeah. And that was, for me, that was really insightful to just like how to set up the room, right? And so like I've seen that on Instagram and the reels where the inspector is coming in and it's like, hey, you don't know why you can't sleep. And then they put the device next to the bed and it's like off the charts because somebody, and that's what I think the problem was in the apartment buildings, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the apartment buildings are generally going to be higher EMF because you have all these little towers that are going off. And then God knows the electrical issues. And then like how many people are turning off their Wi-Fi at nighttime?
Yeah. With the higher density living, right? Whether it be a high-rise condo or an apartment building or even like a row housing or things like that, it's just these wireless access points or these Wi-Fi routers are just closer to you, right? You might have one above and below or on either side, and that common wall could be where your bed is, and your head of your bed could be on a common wall, and the 6 inches on the other side of that wall could be a wireless access point. So,
Yep.
so usually it's the wireless environment that's increased. We typically find the wiring in commercial buildings is actually quite good, and
Yep.
it actually
Because
is
it has to
shielded.
be because there's so many people using it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, yeah, and they have a metal clad. There's this metal sheathing over top of the wiring, and they do that for fire safety. But that actually blocks one of the fields that come off the wires, the electric field component. So yeah, so sometimes in these apartments and condos, wireless is usually elevated, but usually the EMS from the electricity is actually quite low and reasonable. So
So that's good to know. Yeah, that's good
yeah.
because I know, like, if somebody's listening to this and they live in the apartment, like, I have to move now.
Yeah. With apartments and condos, it's corner units are usually lower, right? Because you have one less neighbor. If you're on the ground floor, you don't have a neighbor below you, so usually they're lower. And the other thing to look for is where that electrical room is on your floor. There's usually one unit that usually has the second bedroom or the den or the storage room that backs right onto that room, and that room tends to be a higher exposure room. So when it comes to condos and apartments, those are kind of the
Yeah,
quick and
yeah.
dirty checks. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good to know. Yeah, but like our fix was like the quick fix was just move the crib to the other side. And then, the long-term fix, because you actually found there was a bunch of wiring issues in the house. And how does that get through? So like if we know it's not up to code, how is that still happening? Because obviously, like, is it just people rushing, people not staying up to, because it's supposed to be up to code and it's not. So like, how do we get here?
It's just a process, right? So what happens when a home gets built is there is a visual inspection by the electrical inspector twice. One before the drywall goes up, and second when everything has been completed. And so he is visually checking that everything's okay. But if they were to functionally check if everything was okay, in almost every single home, even brand new homes, in 12 years, I've seen one home that didn't have a wiring error in it. Okay.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, so it's very common. Sometimes the wiring error is in like a broom closet and kind of somewhere tucked away, and I don't really bring it up to the homeowner because it's such a low use area and has no impact on the health. So we just kind of push that one off to the side. But in your case, right, it was affecting the sleeping area, some of the office space, some of the main
Yep.
floor. So it was affecting the high use areas and specifically the sleeping areas. So we brought it up. Basically, what we do is we do a functional test of your home to see if there's any wiring errors, right? So it's not a visual, it's a little more, it's a deeper dive than that. And we do the functional test to do that. So in your home, we turned on all the lights and we were using something called an amp clamp and clamping on all the branch circuits to see if we can see anything that was unusual there. And we did because I suspected it because we are getting very high magnetic fields in some of the areas. So
Showing it that, like, look, I found it.
yeah, it's here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's here. Yeah. And how do you go about fixing that? So that's something that, we're looking to book with you soon here, that it's like, to me, that seems like, okay, once they screwed it up, like, how do you even fix that? Because there's so much that goes into wiring of the house, is my understanding anyways.
In some homes it's a little bit more messy even than yours, and in that case we just have to go through the whole panel and do what we call an electrical panel audit, and we check for every circuit for possible error, and then that gives us our hit list. In yours it was pretty obvious where they were. So the hard part is figuring out which circuit it is. Once we know which circuit it is, then it's just an exercise with myself and the electrician, and we just trace back the circuit until we find the error. And it's a little bit of a diagnostic work. Sometimes this could be some wire that was vibrating over time and the insulation wore off on the neutral, and that touches the light fixture or inside a multi-gang light switch. Oftentimes we see if you have like 6 lights on a multi-gang light switch and all the neutrals are tied together in there and there's multiple branch circuits, those just have to be separated. So once the electrician kind of knows what the circuit is and what's not right with it, which is kind of what we do,
Yep.
then they can say, okay, yeah, I can kind of find my way back and figure out where the problem is. It's something that we can speak, when I talk to electricians, I don't use magnetic fields, electric fields, or any of that stuff. I use amps and current because that's what they understand.
Totally. Yeah.
And once you explain it to them in that language, it becomes very simple for them to go ahead and troubleshoot. And they think it's a little bit of a game as well, right? They want to find out what the problem is and fix
Totally.
it. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I mean, we're already kind of talking a little bit about solution. I'd love to talk a little bit more diagnostic. Like, so obviously getting an EMF inspector into your house to just do a proper inspection, like to me, that was super, super valuable. I learned a lot. And then we even got to some solutions like, hey, we had an extra half an hour. Can you go ahead and disconnect the oven? If somebody doesn't have access to an EMF inspector, do you recommend an EMF meter device that people can purchase? Or like, what's the next best thing if they don't have access to an EMF inspector in their area?
There's something called the Sage and Gelter protocol, and this was developed in conjunction with Dr. Herbert from the Harvard University. And what it was designed for kids who were on the autism spectrum. And what they found out is they did three things. 80% of the kids showed improvement when they did this. And it's not, again, this is not a silver bullet thing, but it works great for ADH kids and also works great for the general population. And it's really simple, right? The first thing is you turn off your cell phones at night. The second thing is you make sure Wi-Fi, baby monitors, and cordless phones are off at night. And then you turn off the power to the bedroom. So that's the lights and the outlets. When you do that, what actually happens is your wireless environment goes down. If you had wiring errors or different things going on with your electrical system, it is off, right? So it has much less of an impact in the home. So it's just a simple thing. You don't need any meters. You don't need anything. The only thing that we request is when you turn off the power to the bedroom, just make sure your furnace works, your fridge, your freezer, your aquarium, your radon system, if you have one installed, and your smoke detectors and your CO detectors. So just make sure that all those are still working. But if those all work, when you try this out, it could be just a simple thing to do, just to try this out, see if it works. Now, if you know that you have a potential issue, for example, if you're really close to high voltage tension lines, or if you're really close to a cell tower, or you suspect wiring errors or things like that, then we're looking at actually measuring, because I can't recommend anything unless I know what your exposure is and where it's coming from, and what the duration of in which you are actually exposed to it. So if you're exposed for 1 second a year from an exposure, I'm not too concerned about that. If you're exposed to something 24 hours a day and it's at a low level, there may be something that we can do with it. So that involves getting some meters, right? And depending on what you're looking for and what's going on, we'll recommend different meters. So if you're just worried about the high voltage tension line, right, it's going to be something like a Tri-Field TF2, and that's going to be $273 or Canadian or something in that range. And it's really good at measuring magnetic fields. So it'll give us a good idea of what your exposure is from a high voltage tension lines, right?
Say the name of that again. It's Tri-Field, you said?
Tri-Field TF2. That's really good for magnetic field. So that's going to check for wiring errors in your home. That's going to check for if you have a pump or a motor. It's going to check if the electrical meter on the other side of your bedroom wall is affecting you. So a whole bunch of things, right? And from the power line. So that's a really good meter for that type of thing. And when we look at the wireless technology, for example, we're looking at something called the Safe and Sound Classic 2 is the name of the meter, or the Safe and Sound Pro. One just has little LED lights showing you a slight concern all the way up to an extreme concern. From a building biology standpoint or environmental medicine perspective, those meters work really well for that. And they'll capture everything that's inside your house, right? They'll capture the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, the cordless phones, the smart appliances, your security system, all the wireless stuff. Those ones capture all of that, all the cell phone frequencies. Doesn't include the millimeter 5G band, but it includes everything else. So that works. I
love what you said about like, I'm not going to recommend anything unless I know what the issue is. I think it's really powerful because like, that's what I'm really about, is like customization and personalization. There's at some point where like the generalities of, okay, let's turn off the Wi-Fi at nighttime. Let's turn off the cell phones. Let's like just try that out and see what happens. But it might not make a big difference if, number one, like your smart oven is shooting a bunch of electromagnetic fields at nighttime. Like you might not notice the difference. And so having that information and seeing the numbers was like, okay, like even my heating pad that's supposed to be low EMF. We're going to talk about that in a second, but it was just like, oh, I need to unplug it because I'm literally just sitting on an electrical field the whole time.
It's so important that once you get the meter, to talk to somebody who actually knows how to use it as well. Because oftentimes I get people, they say, I got this meter, but I just have to get you to come in. I can't make sense of what it's saying. But we can also set up virtual calls with, EMF consultants can do that, where if you have the meters, we can step you through the process, right? And so that becomes very easy as well. And that just expedites everything, right? Gets you to, I have no idea what's going on, which is what creates a lot of this fear and a lot of this anxiety, right? When you don't know. But as soon as you know what the exposure is and what you can do about it, that fear just kind of dissolves because you're now in control of it. Mm-hmm. You need something to measure before we can suggest any actionable steps, for sure.
That's just in line with me, because I'm all about like run the lab work, track the data, understand what's going on, because I hate it when people say natural medicine doesn't work, because it's just like, what do you mean? Like, what part of it didn't work? The eating better, the sleeping better, the moving your body, like the taking supplements, so it's just that tells me you've been too general and you haven't actually gone into the specifics. Talk to us about some of the protecting devices. So, because in my world, there is a lot of protecting EMF things that you can plug in that's supposed to really help protect your home, from the clothes that you can wear that protect EMFs to like things that you can carry on yourself. What is some of your kind of take on all of this stuff, accuracy, and is it worth it?
Whenever there's any type of exposure when it comes to electromagnetic fields, there's kind of three main things we can do about it, right? We can remove the source that deals with the root cause of the problem, right? So that's
rewiring your house if you need to. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And oftentimes if you have wiring errors, you don't need to rewire the house. Like those fixes do not include tearing out drywall and things like that. That's going into the junction boxes.
I imagined.
Yeah. No, it's just going
coming in and breaking down the walls.
Rip it all out. No, it's really just at the light switches and the junction boxes and at your electrical panel, just making sure that everything is wired up properly. So there's no drywall or painting involved with this procedure. It's just an electrician and an EMF expert with that. So if you can remove the source, that's great. You deal with the root cause. And then the other ones are a little bit like Band-Aid solutions, but sometimes they can be very effective. One is distance. So whether it be a wireless router or a cell phone or a cell tower, every time you double your distance from one of those devices, you reduce your exposure 400%. So moving a wireless access point away from where the sleeping areas are or the napping areas if you have young kids, can be an important kind of strategy in all this, right? And then the last one is shielding. Shielding is always a double-edged sword. So if we were to shield a whole house from wireless technology to block the cell phone tower that's down the block, your cell phone wouldn't work in there, and the Wi-Fi signals would bounce around inside as well. So it's a double-edged sword. So you have to know a little bit what you're doing and usually get somebody who knows what they're doing to help you out with that particular part. When we go into shielding electric fields from electrical wiring, we can just use something conductive and ground it. Magnetic fields are very hard to shield from. There are just certain strategies that we can use under certain circumstances to do that. But oftentimes we want to fix the wiring error or use distance to mitigate those. There's also dirty electricity, which is electrical noise. Again, we like to deal with the root cause of the problem first. Right? Remove dimmer switches if possible, figure out what the problem is. If we can't, sometimes we use filtering, but we can only use filtering if you fix all the wiring errors in your home. So it gets a little complicated with it, but there are strategies. There are film, there are fabrics, there are paint, there is foil, there is mesh. There's all these different types of shielding strategies for it. For people who live next to high voltage tension lines, there's this thing called active cancellation, which is kind of like noise canceling headphones for power lines, but we usually don't recommend those. Usually we recommend moving from those areas versus putting in kind of these kind of Band-Aid solutions. And then the last thing that people always ask me about is, what about the pendants, the harmonizers, the stickers, and all those? And sometimes I feel like I'm not really all that qualified to answer that question, because everything I do is in physics. Okay. And these kind of work on a kind of an energetic level, and not to get too woohoo here, but that's just how they work. I can't measure their effect with my physics meters. And just like people who get like a Reiki treatment, for example, right? And the person puts the hands over the body and their hands heat up, the practitioner, and the body heats up, but yet, I couldn't measure anything with my EMF meters of what's going on there. But that's a physiological response to something that's happening there. And with these harmonizers and pendants and everything else, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to elicit a physiological response that's beneficial to you from these devices. And, some of them may work, some of them may not. I just don't have the equipment to actually measure that. But what we often find with people is nothing beats actually removing the electromagnetic fields. Yeah. We like to fight physics with physics. If that's where the root cause of the problem is, we'll fight it with that, not with the metaphysics or the other things. Sometimes I kind of equate it to keep taking the Tylenol for your headache type of thing, when I find it's more effective just trying to figure out why you're getting those headaches and fix it at that level. So
yep, for sure. Yeah, that was really eye-opening for me as well, because I think that the logical part of your brain is like, how does it work? Right? Like, how does it work? How does wearing a t-shirt block and for sure that it makes sense, but I like the Reiki example that you use. And I think it really depends on the sensitivity of the person, right? Because some people are going to be more sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. Now, I'm curious, do you notice a difference between the sign that they are, like a Libra versus an Aries, versus that they're more sensitive? If you've noticed that, because I've heard that air signs. So if you're an air sign, you're going to be more sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. I haven't gotten down the rabbit hole, but it makes sense.
Yeah, I haven't added that to my intake form, is what's your sign. But what we generally find, and this is a big generalization, okay, that I think it's called a phenotype is the correct description of it. And for whatever reason, it's the people who are smaller in stature and are thinner in stature that tend to be affected the most. And I don't know why that is, but I've had a couple of environmental medicine doctors kind of suspect when they see that type of phenotype. So what we find with people that are electrically hypersensitive is there's these, we call them precursors, and this is from Dr. Meg DeHavis. These precursors are not necessarily the cause. It just seems to be that people who experience these things tend to be more electrically hypersensitive. So it's people who have like physical trauma, like whiplash is a very common one that people become a little more sensitive to. It could be a biological trauma. It could be like Lyme disease or a tick bite or something to that effect. It could be like mercury amalgams, right, which is a heavy metal toxin. So all these different types of trauma, and could be like some people when they get electrocuted by lightning or otherwise become electrically hypersensitive. And to deal with that, it's like reduce your exposure, right? Reset your limbic system, because sometimes your body's kind of in this constant fight or flight. Boost your immune system, right? So these are all things that you need a practitioner to kind of help you out with. And then it's like detox, perhaps DNA testing just to see how their pathways are doing, and dental work to get the dental amalgams out of their body. So that's just a general kind of catch-all. And I'm just the first part of that. I'm just the reduce the exposure part.
What it helped me understand is there's no amount of rocks and there's no amount of clothes that you could buy and no amount of whatever if you have electrical issues in the house. Like, that's just the thing that has to be dealt with. And I always say the same thing with, if you have a B12 deficiency, like, that's great. But if you don't understand why you have that B12 deficiency, there's no amount of B12 that's gonna fix it, because you haven't fixed the leak, and so you have to fix the leak in order. So to me, it was just like, I love my rocks that I have, and I love my little EMF things, because I do notice a difference. Yeah. And I think it really depends on the person. Like, for example, Reiki is something I've had it done, and I was like, I don't feel anything. And maybe it was just the practitioner, or maybe it was the time that I tried it, But I know for some people it's life-changing. So it's like, are you going to argue that because you can't see or feel it? It's like, who cares? The person feels better. They feel better. Like, it doesn't matter, it, like, at some point it just doesn't. But yeah, you can't argue physics when it's like, hey, your house is just miswired and you have this giant hole or like dirty electricity, because as soon as that's removed or fixed, the results just speak for themselves.
Yeah, and it's just reducing the stress on the body, right? And oftentimes people's constitution is unique, so they're going to experience one thing or another. But, whether it be someone who's skinny as a rail or someone who's larger and they eat a bag of potato chips all the time, every day, right? That's a stress on both of those bodies, even though it appears differently, right? And it's the same thing with EMFs, is even if you're not feeling it, you are getting this low level stress on your body, which is just adding to all the other stresses that you have in your life. So everyone can benefit from it. Just
filling up the bucket. Yeah. I use the bucket analogy a lot. Amazing. Yeah. So Mitch, I know you have a lead magnet for us that people can click and download below. But will you tell us where we can find you and kind of some of your services that you provide? So if somebody is looking for an EMF consultant, because if you're doing something virtual, that's amazing, because that changes what I can tell my patients, because they've been looking, after your service, I was like, you got to find somebody in your area, because it's like, it was super valuable. So tell people where they can find you and what you do for them.
My company name is EMF Aware. So it's emfaware.ca is the website. And we do EMF consulting for existing builds, like going into people's homes, like an EMF inspection. We also do consultations for people who are building new homes as well. So that's a whole different ball game with that.
Super powerful. Yeah. Because then you can just do it right the first time.
Yeah. And it's pretty economical to do when you're doing a new build versus it's a little bit more expensive to fix some things once the home is built. And so, so we're doing quite a bit of those. And yeah, we do virtual consults. I've done them in the US, in Brazil, in Canada, the United Arab Emirates. So all over the world, we do consults. And sometimes you'll have to get some meters in order to make the most out of the consultation. We kind of handle everything in the EMF world for homes and workplaces. There is the lead magnet that you talked about, that there'll be a link down below.
Top 10 EMF resources for expecting parents and parents to be. So that's exciting. That's exactly what we need.
Yes.
In my audience.
So there'll be things in there like the Safe Baby Project, which is just a one page. It's not a one page. It's a brochure for pregnant women who are expecting, and it tells them all about the electromagnetic fields and kind of what to do about it and those type of things. So that's done by a nonprofit organization down in the US that I've worked with on different things. If you read one thing only, if you're expecting or going to be expecting, that would be kind of one document that kind of lays things out very, very nicely for you.
It's amazing. No, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to say before we let you go? Anything that you feel like we missed maybe, or that's important for the audience to know?
I think the only thing that I'm going to say is there's sometimes a lot of kind of anxiety about, about the unknown. And I would say that in almost all cases, people are super relieved once they figure out what their exposure is and what they can do about it. And the truth of the matter is it's the things that are closest to you that are affecting you the most. Okay. And those are the things you have control over. So when people are worried about, the 10 different Wi-Fi things that are there, well, it's only yours is probably affecting you probably 10 times worse than those other ones, right? Totally. And if you're worried about the cell phone down the street, well, I would probably be a little bit more concerned about the Wi-Fi and turning that off at night, because that's going to probably have a bigger impact on you than those type of things. So the things that are closest to you are the things that are affecting you the most, and that's what you have control over. So just kind of keep that in your mind.
Yep. And if we have way more control than we think. I think,
yeah.
I battled with this as well. It's like running lab work, and it's a lot of anxiety at first before you get the results. You're like, I probably have cancer. I'm going to die. Or in my case, people are like, I'm never going to be able to have kids. And it's like, that's not when we can actually see it, it's like, look, these are gut infections. And then this is what's going on in your, vitamins and minerals. And we can fix that, those things. And whether it's the conventional medical system that has made us believe that we're just not able to heal or whatever, we just don't have control. But I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a lot of anxiety around environmental toxins and EMF being considered one of those. But like you said, I felt great relief after having you come over, even though you exposed a bunch of stuff, right? Like you exposed hey, here's a bunch of stuff here and here and here. But it also allowed me to we're just going to move the crib to the other wall. And then we're going to unplug our oven. And then we're going to turn off the Wi-Fi. And then some of the little stuff that you're like, hey, looks like this clock is emitting stuff. I'm like, we're just not down here that often. I'm not going to bother with the rewiring and the whatever, because it's just that's not worth it to me, because I'm there for 30 minutes 3 times a week. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to my computer that I sit at every day. It's we need to figure that out ASAP, or our sleeping areas, obviously.
Yep. And then just the one other thing for all the guys out there, get the cell phone out of the pocket if you're thinking about kids in the future. There is over 190 studies showing sperm virility tanks when your cell phone's in your pocket. So that was the other little tidbit.
Yep. Where do you recommend to carry it? Do you recommend to turn it on the Wi-Fi? Because that was another thing that I learned from you. It's hey, just turning it on airplane mode half the times doesn't turn off the cellular data, the Bluetooth, the whatever other connections we have. So it takes it down, but it's not as much as I thought.
If you do only one thing, just throw it in your backpack versus anywhere on your body. That amount of distance can, as far as your sperm virility goes, will
Yeah, totally. That can
definitely
make a
help.
big difference.
Right.
And it will make a
Yeah.
difference in the women. So we talked about why they don't test women is because it's like you can't like pull out ovaries or like eggs and be like, this is the quality of the egg. It's a lot harder to do that in research. So they just study males a lot more. But it doesn't mean that if it's impacting sperm quality, like and the mitochondria, it's impacting egg quality as well.
Most definitely. That's the whole trick with biology there on the female side is it's just it's not easy to study, and that's just why there's more information on the male virility.
But yeah, so just throwing it in the backpack. And do you recommend things like putting it on airplane mode when you're carrying it on you if you can?
That would be Mitch's ideal world for sure. But I find people will do that really well for about 3 days and then just leave it on. So I rather them throw it in their backpack than have it physically on their body. I just find that something sustainable that people can do. And yeah.
Versus in the back pocket is not enough.
I wouldn't do it anywhere on your body because your body is absorbing much more of that radiation when it's right on you. Cell phones are usually tested at a few millimeters away from your body. So you're often going over what's actually considered the safety guidelines from a thermal standpoint if it's right up against your skin or even just a thin piece of fabric in between there. So that's why all the cell phone holders and stuff hold it this far away from you, because that's what they're actually measured at, which is not necessarily how people use them. Some people actually touch the cell phone to their head. So yeah, cell phones are a tricky one, but for the guys and for everyone else, I would just not have it on your person. Throw it in the backpack. If you can put it on airplane mode, great. If you can turn off the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth when you're not using it, great. Just add some distance.
Just getting used to it and doing it, that's a huge exposure. And we're seeing a lot of an increase in brain tumors from using cell phones, right?
Yeah, they call it ipsilateral on the side of the face of where they actually use the phone, and there's increases in saliva gland tumors
that makes sense.
In the brain. For the women that actually put it in their breast, in the bra, there's studies done on that as well that show increased breast cancer in the exact location where the cell phone was. So,
Eeks. Okay, so I hope you guys found this helpful. Mitch, thank you so much for being here. We'll put all the information down below so people know how to contact you. I didn't realize that you could see people virtually, so I think that that's going to really help because I've been just like raving about and a bunch of my patients are virtual and they're not in Calgary, and so they're like, how do I find a Mitch? And so hopefully they're able to just contact you and you can walk them through what you need.
Yeah, or I'll hook them up with somebody who's local to them as well. Obviously, having a person there is slightly better than doing it virtually. So and then they don't have to buy the equipment as well. So yeah, feel 100%. Free to reach out and we'll hook you up one way or another.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thanks you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next week.